Okay, we're on. Welcome to the second to last class in the series. And before we start, I want to touch on a couple of points that we talked about in previous classes to kind of add a couple ideas. Are we okay? Is it? Okay. And one of those, by the way, it's kind of amusing. I mentioned, I think it was in the second class, about the Jewish gesture, mudra you might say, that they use in the synagogues for Shin, and how Leonard Nimoy appropriated that apparently for Star Trek. And I asked the question whether or not Leonard Nimoy was Jewish, and William, I think, said that he was. And I happened just a few days ago to stumble across this article on a Jewish website that talks about that very point, about Leonard Nimoy and how he first, when he was in the synagogue as a child, he happened to see them do this. They're not supposed to look up in the front of the temple when they're doing this ritual, but he heard these bizarre noises coming out of the rabbis, I guess, so he looked up and he sees the priest doing what did Spock call that? I don't remember. But he wound up using that, in fact. I mean, that was, he admitted that himself, which I thought was cute. Another point was, we talked in the first lecture, I talked about the quote-unquote dualistic idea of spiritual individualism, you might say, the idea that that you find in some of the traditions that Shelley Trimmer, my one teacher, taught, the idea that we weren't created by God, but in fact, let me go back. I don't need to have that image on there the whole time. That we weren't created by God. We have the divine spark within us. And that in fact we're individual atmas, as they might say in the yoga trade, that we're brothers and sisters of God, not children of God. And again, I'm not going to get into the hair splitting about different notions of God, transcendent versus immanent, God versus Godhead. That's maybe for a later time. But I remembered a conversation that Kriyananda related that he had with Shelley once when Shelley was talking to him about this kind of individualistic idea that you have your own unique individual spirit. It's not just, you're behind this drama, behind this lila, there's one of us. And he asked Shelley, why doesn't the church teach this in the West? And Shelley said, how are they going to get control over you if you are taught that you have your own individual divinity, so to speak, that we don't give it to you, in a sense. And so in a sense, it's almost a political move, maybe not even just in a sense, but it's a way to fill the coffers. It's a way to get control. As long as you can get people to believe that you really don't have that spark of divinity in you, and that you have to come to us and put money on our plates, they're going to perpetuate that idea. And this is part of the reason why you have these movements in the first few centuries AD that cropped up. Hermeticism, which was basically it's really started in Alexandria, this amalgam of Greek and Roman, not Roman so much, but Greek and Egyptian and possibly even Hindu, I suppose, because there was some exchange going on, I believe. It was a very individualistic notion of spirituality. It's a whole topic in itself. But then you had the Gnostic movements, which were these kind of offshoots of Christianity, which again believed in the individual essence. And these groups were considered heretical by the Roman Catholic Church for a number of reasons, but that was clearly one of them, the idea that if you can know the divinity within yourself, why would you have to go to a church? And the Hermetic and Gnostic movements were much more individualistic, more democratic in that sense, and not as well organized, certainly, as centralized like you had with the Roman Catholic Church, which cracked a pretty loud whip. But this actually, according to some scholars, when I started working here back in 89, 90, I helped put together a book for Stephan, not for, but with Stephan Heller that he did called Freedom. And it was about, he's a Gnostic scholar and a Gnostic priest actually out in California. And one of the ideas in his book was that the individualism of modern American democracy comes from several sources. It was influenced to some extent by the Iroquois Indians. There's a Jungian view that had to do with the individuation of the individual and the ego and all this sort of thing. But he also said that to some extent the American founding fathers and mothers were influenced by the Hermetic tradition, which came back into popularity during the Renaissance through people like scholars like Pico and Ficino, and influenced Freemasonry and people like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, this notion of the individual spark, which gave rise to this idea of personal rights. We have rights. In the Renaissance, that Hermetic individualism came up in the form of recognizing individual genius like Michelangelo and Leonardo, but then in the age of the Enlightenment and the rise of America, you had this notion of the individual divinity became very important, and in personal rights. Well, either I'm going out of focus or the camera is. I'm not sure which it is. All right. Was that because I moved back and it autofocus on there? Okay. All right. I'll have to stay in focus from now on. There's a lesson in there for me, I'm sure. Another point that I wanted to mention was that in last week's talk, I believe it was last week's, I talked about a holistic approach to spiritual practice in the sense of not just trying to get to that transcendent, enlightened state, but trying to harmonize all the different vehicles, all the different aspects of ourselves, and create the body of light, you might say. So that's not just the head and the penthouse of the proverbial building of your being that becomes emphasized, but the entire infrastructure. And it recalled, I was thinking back to, in 1990, I think, I was in California, and I happened to hear a talk by Manly Palmer Hall, who was well known around here. In fact, he used to come to teach here in the library years ago, and a brilliant scholar. And it was his last public talk ever. He was 90 years old and gave this incredibly eloquent talk. He's most famous for a book called Secret Teachings of All Ages, which he wrote unbelievably in his 20s. This large book that goes into all the different esoteric traditions. One of the few books that Shelley recommended, by the way. Shelley didn't recommend many books, but he said that was a very interesting resource. He also recommended the Bible, by the way, for the esoteric knowledge, not for the dogma, but for he said there was a lot of occult knowledge, especially in the Old Testament. And so in this last lecture that he gave, it was on his 90th birthday. And he was physically very feeble, but it was an eloquent talk. With no notes, he just spun this thing off. And it was called The Garment of Light. And it basically, if I were to distill it down to a few sentences, it was this idea that the garment of light is an idea that you find in various esoteric traditions. And what it really amounts to is similar to what I was talking about the last few lectures of the perfected soul, the illuminated personality and all the sheaths and all that. And the way he described it at one point in the lecture, which really stood out in my memory, was how for every virtuous act that you perform and every virtuous thought that you think, it's like a little spark in your aura. And that after a lifetime, or after so many years, he didn't specify a time frame, but he said after a while of doing this, you eventually create an entire garment of light, because there's so much integrity to what you do and so much virtue in your actions and your thoughts that all these sparks add up to this glowing aura, this sheath that emanates purity. And that's very similar to what we were talking about last week, that enlightenment isn't just about meditating and getting to higher states. It's also about bringing that down into the lower sheaths and the lower levels of your being, as well as purifying those sheaths through things like detox and right action and avoiding negativity and that sort of thing. If there's any, as always, I always have to say, if there's any confusion about any of these points, feel free to jump in and write them down, or those in the room can ask me. Getting back to that point, this idea of what is enlightenment, and enlightenment isn't merely this heightened state. It's really a holistic view of enlightenment, of spirituality, is the totality, not just the upper levels, but all the different levels, and trying to harmonize everything, not just one part of your being. And but having said that, the techniques are important, and what I want to do tonight as part of our talk is give a very simple sort of 3-step program of meditation that people can use, because I've taught meditation for many years. I'm not teaching it right now except in this class. And I try to distill what I learned from all the different teachers that I studied with and try to put it in a very, very simple distilled form. And we'll get to that. But I do feel we have to go over certain techniques just very briefly to give you a sense of the range, because there's so many different techniques, and all roads lead to Rome, or as Ram Dass used to say, all roads lead to Om. And so you have this eclectic variety of techniques that will all get you where you want to go if you really work with them. But it's not that every technique is right for every person. Some people may work better with mantras, some may work better with visualizations, etc. So let's briefly go over a couple of these. For example, mantra, which is sacred sound. I remember as a kid sitting at the kitchen table with my mother and father drank coffee, and I remember, I did not at that age, needless to say, but I remember watching them drink the coffee. And just as a kind of a little game I played with myself, I started saying the word coffee over and over again in my mind, and coffee, coffee, and pretty soon it became a nonsense sound. Fee coffee, it didn't hold any meaning any longer. And it kind of put me into a trance state. It was like, it was very weird. It was because it got stripped of its meaning, and then it became pure vibration, pure sound. And in a sense, mantra has that ability to take you beyond meaning. And it could be any sound, it can be any word, though in the esoteric traditions, they do put a certain emphasis on sacred sounds, like the name of a deity or the name of a certain quality. Like Ananda is not a person; it's a quality of bliss. And so it's best to choose a sound that means something to you, whether that's of a religious nature or something that holds meaning. It could be the name of someone for you, or a name of a pet for that matter. But the point is, by chanting it, in a sense, these meditation techniques are ways of preoccupying the mind so that your awareness can really flower, your awareness can really unfold. And but it's also a way of concentration. We're going to get back to this in a moment here. All these techniques, to some extent, are ways of collecting the energies of the mind and bringing them to a point. Kind of like what I did last week with the flashlight, where I took the flashlight and brought it down onto the paper. It's like you see the diffused awareness, and then the technique brings your awareness into a point, and that's where samadhi comes in, effortless concentration, heightened awareness, you might say. And light, an experience of light, of luminosity, literally, not figuratively. And so in a sense, you could say that mantras are a way of purifying the mind stream. Now, this is something you have in every tradition. One of the things that, I guess that doesn't matter if I touch that one. You have it in the Christian tradition, for example, with Gregorian chanting monks. And you have it in the Buddhist tradition. This is very similar to where I was at the monastery in upstate New York. Before we would do these long meditation sittings, which sometimes would run anywhere from 3 to 12 hours, though it's broken up into 30-minute increments. I have to keep emphasizing this because nobody can sit for 12 hours without moving. We would always do a chant beforehand. It was a Buddhist chant, a lengthy Buddhist chant. And it was partly, it's an invocation, you might say, for the energies of the universe, but it's also a way to focus the mind and purify the mind stream. because the mind is so cluttered with mental chatter, the everyday sort of mental chatter, that the technique helps kind of remove some of that dross from the mind stream. So there's mantra. There's also breathing techniques. We talked about alternate breathing, like where you breathe. Oh, I want to show you one other photograph here before. This is a very nice photograph of Buddhist chanting. It almost looks a little more like a photo op than a formal ritual, but it's still very pretty nonetheless. Then we have the breathing techniques, and I showed you how alternate breathing was taking the right and left nostrils and alternating exhale, inhale, switch, exhale, inhale, switch. And that centers the energies in the center of the spine, but it also is a way of stilling the mind. If you do the alternate breathing technique, you really notice, almost more than any other technique I've done, the mind settling down if you can do it for even just 5 minutes. It's very powerful as a technique. But these breathing techniques are also for the purpose of getting more oxygen into your lungs, more prana, you might say. And so they talk a lot about, abdominal breathing, where you breathe out through the belly. And breathing more deeply. When I taught yoga years ago, one of the things that I emphasized was, if you want to breathe more deeply, there's a very simple technique, and that is exhale more deeply. If you exhale out like that, more air automatically comes back into your lungs. It's a very simple way to deal with that. Now at the monastery, when I had that technique that I talked about last week, and when I had that experience, that kind of mini samadhi that I had last week, I was simply doing a counting the breath technique, which is the training wheels technique they give you at the monastery when you're just starting out, where you count on each exhale. You're sitting there, your eyes are open in that tradition. That's not as true in yoga. You find it in some yogic traditions, but usually that's more of a Buddhist thing, where you're sitting there still and you're looking at the floor or the wall, depending on the denomination of Buddhism. And you're counting on each exhale, 1 mentally, 2 on the exhale, 3 on the exhale, and when you get to 10, you go back to 1 and start over. That's because you can easily start getting into a rote state where you're counting mindlessly, and you get to 100 and you realize, whoa, you just did that unconsciously. So you check yourself by going back to 1, and it's very powerful, even if it's as simple as can be. And there's other aspects to pranayama, which has to do with manipulating the prana within your system, and that's where the right and left nostril, for example, relate to Ida and Bengali on the right and left-hand side of the spine, and the mouth relates to the center channel, and there are techniques where you breathe and you manipulate the energy in your vehicle, and that's not at all important to know at this point. But there again, too, I think that it's a way to purify the mind and to concentrate the mind by doing this. If you try it, like I say, even just for 4 or 5 minutes, you will really notice the mind settling down. And another technique, a very simple technique, is simply meditating on love, loving kindness meditation, where you imagine you're just emanating out love. Now, if you have any difficulty with, I remember, it's a funny story. I thought it was funny, where this woman came to Shelley and said, what if it's not the perfect kind of love? And he said, just love. And she said, well, but it may not be really pure. And he said, just love. And he put it really simply. It's a nice way to think about it. People want it to be perfect, and it's not always perfect, and that's okay. You work your way up. But a technique that I think is really useful for kind of purifying it, for expanding on it, maybe is a better way to put it, is take something you do love, like it can be, for me, I find pets to be a really good point of visualization or meditation, because there's very little baggage attached to the pet, whereas with a spouse or with a parent or with, people, there's often, even if it's a deceased person, there's that sadness, I suppose. So picking something that is a positive sort of uplifting or inspiring sort of image, I think, is really important. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. But so you start with that positive embodiment of love, whether it be a person or a divinity or of a pet, and you use that to prime the pump, to use an old phrase. And then you build on it. You imagine the feeling. You imagine that there's love coming from that person or creature or the deity, and you're sending it back out. And you expand on it. You inflate it, so to speak. And then you take it beyond that symbol, that person or creature. And you then send it out, maybe from the heart chakra out into the whole universe. And you just go deeper and deeper into it. That's a very powerful sort of meditation technique. Now, another aspect of meditation is visualization, which is what I have here. You can take a yantra or a mandala. This is Sri Yantra. And you focus your attention in the middle. Let me get the arrow going here. Oh, that went right to the middle. And this is a more formal sort of mandala that you have from the Buddhist tradition, which is very complex and has a lot of associations for a Buddhist in terms of the deities. And in the middle, that's a Buddha in the middle, I believe. I don't know this particular mandala as well. And I have one very similar to this in my living room, in fact, hanging on the wall, although I think mine's prettier. And you have these different animals and creatures around the rim, and these things are a way of centering your awareness into the middle, and by doing that, you not only activate, shall we say, the divinity in yourself, but it's a way of focusing the mind like we've been talking about here. But you can make your own mandala or yantra. This is one that I found on the internet that someone did using computer graphics, and this one would work perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. If you imagine just focusing your attention in the middle and you just keep looking at it for minutes upon end, and you breathe in slowly, and even if you blink, that's okay. You just keep focusing on the middle. You will start to notice a certain focusing of your entire being into a point, and can lead to a samadhi kind of experience. Now, the question is, how do we put all this together? And what I'm going to propose here, and what I've taught for many years, and I think it's a fairly effective way to do this if you're new to meditation, is what I call a three-step method. And the first step, let's say you're just meditating to start with. You do not want to start with a half-hour or an hour-long meditation if you've never meditated before. Shelley used to say that when you start meditating, you meditate for 1 or 2 minutes. And then maybe the next week you expand it out to 2 or 3 minutes. You slowly work your way up. A lot of people, when they first get into meditation, they go too far and they wind up getting disillusioned and tired, and they never go back to it again. That's very common. So start off small. As Shelley said, and as I've quoted before in this class, if you're not enjoying it, you're not doing the meditation properly. You should be able to enjoy it. And sitting for 1 minute should be fairly enjoyable. I do think it's important to keep the body still, because the more your body is moving around, usually the more scattered your mind is. Now, let me explain this through a metaphor, focusing, uplifting, being, through a metaphor. I lived down in Cocoa Beach, Florida quite a while, and I lived near NASA. And think of the first stage as like the preparation for a blast-off, where all of the different employees and technicians and astronauts have to gather into the base. They have to come together for this blast-off to be possible. So that's akin to concentrating the energies. Your mind is very scattered. You sit down to meditate. You've got to start collecting the energies, collecting the thoughts. That's what the mantra, the visualization, the loving kindness meditation, etc. These come into play. And then the next stage, after maybe you've done that for a minute or two, the next stage is what I would relate to blast off, in the sense of lifting. As Kriyananda used to say, it's not just about interning, it's about lifting. Intern and lift. How do you lift? You lift by picking something to focus on that is inspiring or evokes love for you, like the face of a loved one. It could be a grandmother, it could be a pet, it could be a deity, it could be some inspiring celebrity for that matter. As long as it lifts your energies, as long as there's an inspirational quality to it, you will feel the energies, if you're paying attention, start lifting up the spine in a very gentle way, not in any kind of dangerous way. And so as that starts to happen and the awareness goes higher, eventually higher, and I've seen so many of these blast-offs down in Florida. Just absolutely gorgeous, but they're very inspiring, and I really believe that watching these had a kind of a ritual symbolic effect on my spinal energies. You could almost feel the energies going up your spine as you watch this rocket, the shuttle, whatever, go up in the sky. Then you get to the third stage, which I relate to just being as a metaphor, you might say, or rather the other way around, weightlessness, where you're just being present. You're not trying to do anything. You're not trying to get anywhere. You're just being present to what is, to the I am that I am, so to speak. And that's where you drop the technique. You're not doing any technique at that point, except maybe just breathing and trying to keep the body perfectly still, even if it's just for 1 minute. The only movement really at that point should be your breathing and your heartbeat, of course, and the blood going through your, Although in some yoga traditions you stop the heart, because you slow down the body so much. That was one of the things that Swami Rama used to do at the manager clinic for the scientists that were studying him. He could stop his heart at will. And even though I cannot do that, I don't think it's as far-fetched as it sounds, because your body slows down so much when you get into a deeper state of meditation and you're holding your breath, that I do feel much longer pauses between my heartbeats at a certain point in the meditation. Now, you could add a fourth level to this, which would be, you might call re-entry. And that's where you come back down to earth. You don't want to walk around all spaced out, so you want to open your eyes if they were closed, and you want to maybe take some deep breaths, and you want to maybe even chanting can sometimes bring you back down to earth. But you don't want to remain in maybe a spaced out sort of weightless state, so to speak, when you're trying to get back out into the world. I might even do, if I've had a good meditation, I might even do some push-ups or something to get back in my body, just to kind of feel tangible again. So the first stage, going back to these three stages here, the first stage of the meditation, the concentration, like I say, that can be chanting, that can be a breathing technique, that can be prayer, that can be meditating on a mandala or a yantra. It can be pretty much anything, but pick one thing and go with it. I don't think you should change it every other day. The second stage, like I said, it could be something inspiring, like a person, a creature, can be the image of a beautiful sunset for that matter. Or that can be prayer too, by the way, and there's ways of conflating these first two stages. If you happen to have a deity, let's say like let's say you're Catholic and Mary means a lot to you, well, you could chant the name Mary or Ave Maria while you're gearing up into the meditation, and you can continue that as the inspiring part of it. So it can be both the concentration technique as well as the the blast-off uplifting technique. What did I have next here? Let's see. Yeah, so for example, I've had a lot of Catholic students over the years for whom Mary was a very powerful sort of image. For other people, for a lot of other Christians, it might be Jesus. For people involved in a yogic tradition, like in Kriya Yoga, this is Yogananda. And but lots of people have their own gurus. I've never had a guru. I've studied with gurus. I've never had one. But I still might use Yogananda as an image, because I really do feel he emanates a certain kind of inspiring energy, a certain spiritual energy. And some people might use Babaji. Did I have a picture of Babaji here? No, this is Kuan Yin. This is a goddess of compassion in the Orient, a very powerful image for a lot of Chinese Buddhists. And so then the third stage, like I said, is where you're basically just trying to be present. You're just being, B-E-I-N-G, so to speak. I'm aware that I am. Any questions about this before we go on here? I want to emphasize not only keeping the body still, but when you get into that third stage, and let me go back to that in case you want to write those stages down, if that's of any help to anyone. In that third stage, I feel it's really critical to not only keep the body still, but I do think it's really helpful to hold the breath. And because when you hold the breath, the simplest, quickest way to still the mind, in my opinion, is to hold the breath. Where you sit there, I mean, let's say you're scattered. I was scattered this afternoon because there was someone that acted up with me on Facebook. And there was a political difference, and that got me going. So I went and I sat down and meditated. And so I sat and first thing I did was I held my breath for, I could do it for maybe a minute or so. And I tried to keep the body still. I tried to visualize the centering in the middle of the spine. And that really did wonders. It really helped me get to a point where I was able to go deeper into it. And so keeping the body still or holding the breath is very powerful. When I was at the monastery, and I've told this before, but I want to emphasize this, one of the hardest things of going to the monastery was they force you to sit perfectly still. And I've been to many different spiritual centers where people are meditating and they're scratching and they're moving around in their seat while they're doing their meditation. And no way do they allow that at the Zen center, because it's really, if the mind is moving around, if the body's moving around, the mind is very restless. And the first day or two that you're at the monastery and you go to itch, and the monastery, the Zen practitioner at the end of the hall screams at you, says, "Sit still!" And you freak out because you don't know if they're angry at you or what's going on. And they're not angry at you. This is just what they do. It's the Japanese sort of, tough love sort of thing. And they're perfectly nice people once the sitting is over with. And they're not angry at all. They're just trying to get you to discipline. And so you realize, boy, I better sit still. I don't want to be yelled at again. And you learn how to get past the itchiness and the restlessness. And it's uncanny how when you don't get to that point of discipline, which isn't that hard actually, you think, well, I'm itching. I've got to respond to every little bodily itch or twitch. And when you learn how to do that for a while, you really go a lot deeper. And I really felt, are we laughing over there?
I wasn't so itchy, just even thinking about itching.
I shouldn't talk about itching so much. So you really go much deeper, and I feel that that stillness of the body is really critical. Now there are some questions here I see. Yes, indeed, Ingrid. Sometimes when I meditate, I feel at some point my body begins to shake. That's a little controversial because in some traditions, like in the Osho or Rajneesh's tradition, excuse me, I got to clear my throat. That was actually considered a positive thing, as I understood it, and like you're shaking off Shakti and all this. I personally think, I want to be careful here because I don't want to step on toes if anybody feels that's an important part of their practice. But the body should not be shaking, and if there is that shaking, I would you don't want to resist it either. You don't want to just fight it because I think that makes it worse. It's kind of like in the Buddhist Zen tradition, they talk about when you feel fear, become the fear. The worst thing you can do in a sense when you feel fear is to resist it, because that's like taking a magnifying glass and pulling it back. It makes it bigger. And that's very true, I think, for some kinds of shaking, where there's a certain kind of energy that can come up, and it may be necessary to work that off somehow. Maybe it could be the person needs to get out and exercise more in between their meditations. It could be there's other kinds of energies. I'm not sure I can give a one-size-fits-all answer to that, but I would just try to work through it and try to get to a point where you're not shaking anymore, either through breathing or chanting. Initially, it may be okay to kind of go with it and then to kind of try to go beyond it if you can. And Sandy, you say, does a state of fasting aid in meditation? I think it does, but you don't want to go to an extreme to where hunger is actually getting in the way of the meditation. So I think it's much safer to simply cut back on the amount of food. The hardest time to meditate at the monastery, there were 3 times. On an off day, there were 3 meditation sittings. There was an hour in the morning before breakfast, there was an hour after lunch, and then there was an hour in the evening. The hardest part was the hour after lunch, because you want to just fall right asleep, and you're fighting the demons of sleep, so to speak. And it's hard to really focus on meditation if your stomach is full. So I would say meditate before you eat, and as a general rule, cut back on the amount of food, and you'll notice that your fasting really does turn your energies inward. It's very powerful, but not everybody knows how to do it properly. People go to extremes with it. So I would say cut back on the amount. And you say, I do not understand your question, Ingrid. What question is that? Did I ask a question? I'm sorry, Ingrid, I'm not sure what you're referring to there. While she's typing, I'll mention, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Well, if there's something more you want to ask, go ahead and type it, and I'll go on to the next point and then come back to it. It's a very simple technique. If you don't want to bother even with the 3 steps I'm talking about here, a very simple meditation technique is simply the loving kindness technique I talked about, where you sit and you just imagine, you focus on love, and you just keep focusing on it. And maybe start with something like a figure of a pet or a person or a deity, whatever, and then go beyond that, spread it out to the whole universe. And that's really powerful in and of itself, and it's very simple. And anyone who says they can't do it, I'm not sure has really tried, because it's like Shelley saying to that woman, just love. You know, it's really that simple. It doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be some cosmic divine love. Now, kind of going beyond that a little bit here. The single most important thing, I would say, even beyond these meditation techniques, is a little something called attitude. And that you can meditate, let's say, for 20 minutes a day, 2 hours a day, but your attitude is something you carry with you all the time. And it's entirely possible to meditate and have even a state of, some kind of enlightenment and not have a good attitude, because you don't necessarily, getting to that penthouse, so to speak, getting to that enlightened state is not the end goal. The end goal is what they call realization, bringing that back down into the real world. And for example, you can have someone who has had a state of heightened awareness, samadhi, some kind of enlightenment, who has a bad everyday attitude, and I've met people like that. Or they might have a big ego, or there's gurus I could mention who I think are probably enlightened, but have really serious problems on a personality level. And then you've got individuals who have great attitudes, but have never meditated a day in their life. Now, which would you rather be? Someone that has a good attitude 24 hours a day, or someone that meditates for an hour or 2 a day and has a great experience in that, but has a bad attitude the rest of the day? And that does happen. That's kind of what I was getting at when I was hinting at a more holistic description of enlightenment or spirituality, that it's not just about reaching a certain state, getting to the mountaintop. It's about the whole picture. And a person with a good attitude, I think, is halfway there in terms of being able to control their mindset, being able to go through everyday life with a certain kind of, well, there's several things here. One is positivity, as far as, what is a good attitude? A part of a good attitude is positivity. So, for instance, I think I have a nice quote here of Marcus Aurelius. Let me see if I can find that. Oh, this is... Let me back up a little bit. I want to address these. I was thinking about, what's a good way to get into the mood for, let's say, a loving kindness meditation, or that positive energy in meditation. you see animals. It might be a picture of an animal you look at before. For some people, it's a cat. For some people, it's a dog. You know, it's. I just thought that was the cutest thing ever. That's why I think animals have a very pure kind of quality about them in terms of as possible objects. Now, I had a woman recently tell me that, you know, she had a dog that had passed on, and she used to not meditate on this picture, but every time she looked at this picture, it was very inspiring because it made her feel somehow. It not only reminded her of her pet, but it also kind of touched her in a way. And I says, well, maybe you can look at that before you go into meditation. So for everybody, it's a little bit different. But now getting back to the point about positivity, this is a great quote by the Roman Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius. When you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love. You know, having that attitude of positivity, which is, there's a line in a movie, I don't think I have it here, but it was from a movie called Undine, and it was, misery is easy, happiness takes hard work. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's very easy to get into a slump of negativity and pessimism, but it takes a certain amount of work to swim against the current and to go into that positive state. Now, the next point I want to mention here is kindness in terms of an attitude. I have met teachers who I thought were pretty enlightened in terms of they described their experience, and there was something that indicated they had that awareness, and yet they weren't particularly kind. And there's a great quote by Jack Kornfield, who's a Buddhist teacher, and I think this is one of the great quotes I've come across in the spiritual literature. Even the most exalted states and most exceptional spiritual accomplishments are unimportant if we cannot be happy in the most basic and ordinary ways. If we cannot touch one another and the life we have been given with our hearts. That's a great idea. You know, it's almost more important to be kind. This is, I think the Dalai Lama would concur with this. It's almost more important to be kind in your everyday life than it is to get enlightenment. Enlightenment may or may not bring that with it, and I know that boggles some people's minds, but it's an unfortunate situation. Now, another point here is, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment, Marcus Aurelius. This deals with the whole notion of controlling the mind. Shelley used to describe meditation as controlled awareness, and I never liked that idea. It wasn't lofty and new agey enough for me. And the older I get, the more I understand what he meant by that. It's the ability to put your mind where you want to put it, when you want to put it there. So if you want to go into a state of samadhi, you can put it there. If you want to be a warrior and you've got someone's attacking your family and you've got to deal with that, you know how to put your awareness there. It's an ability to control your thoughts, ability to control your deeper awareness, your energies. And I'm going to do a little detour here to come back around to this point because I think it's worth talking about a little bit. There was a show on TV a while back, it may still be on, I saw it on cable, called Stan Lee's Superhumans, I think it was. And they had this extraordinary fellow on there, a chi master, who, his name was Dr. Kanzawa, I believe, and he was able to take his chi energies. This used to be on YouTube, but they pulled it down. I think it was with a copyright thing, but it may still be available somewhere. This Dr. Kanzawa, he was able to go where animals were, and by moving his hand and taking the chi energies, he was able to make the animals fall asleep. And these people tested him at this, where they took him to an animal pen, different animal pens actually, like one was llamas, I believe, and another one was deer and elk. And at a distance, with animals he had never met before, he did his routine with his hand of the chi energies, and one by one the animals got down on the ground and fell asleep. And then the man who owned the animals was absolutely staggered by this. But at one point, he put his life on the line. Oops, I'm pressing the wrong button there. This was the herd that laid down of I believe it was elk or caribou, whatever it was. But then there was a pen with bison, large, dangerous bison. Did either of you see that? Yeah. And no one would think of going inside this pen by themselves. And the owner of the pen thought it was suicide to walk into this pen. And the man slowly walked in and did his thing, and not only got up close to the bison, which could have killed him in a second, but he made the bison fall asleep using his technique. I mean, it's extraordinary stuff. And if it's legit, and it didn't look to me like there were any camera tricks, because sometimes these TV shows, they'll edit it in a way where, it's trickery actually. But this did not look to me like trickery. Besides which, I happen to believe that it is possible with the chi energies to do certain interesting things. I have reason to believe that. So now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that I wondered as I watched this, if you can do this to an animal, why can't you do it to a person? And I worked for 6 years in a hypnosis clinic in Naperville, Illinois, where we would hypnotize people with their permission. That's the difference. This was for weight loss and for smoking cessation and other habits. And I got fairly good at it to where I knew how to verbalize the techniques and tailor a hypnotic induction for somebody. But you hear these stories of individuals that are able to do this, like the Chi Master, off the radar, so to speak, surreptitiously. And one of the stories I heard, I studied with the filmmaker named Stan Brakhage years ago, a brilliant genius, now deceased. And he told me about a story of a well-known magician and mystic named Kenneth Anger, who worked with Mick Jagger and Led Zeppelin and all this, and he was a great experimental filmmaker. And Kenneth Anger asked Stan once, do you want to learn about the secrets of magic, high magic, spiritual magic, you might say it, but if you agree to take part in this, I'll bring my friends over and we'll teach you the basics of it, but you can't dabble. By the end of our 2 hours, either you decide to stay with it or not. And Stan, who at that point was an atheist, he converted back to Christianity towards the end, as often happens. But he went to this house in Los Angeles where Kenneth Anger had some of his magical friends with him. And they were talking about magic, and suddenly one of their friends who wasn't in on this whole thing came to the door, rang the doorbell. They let him in, and they thought, okay, what are we going to do with this guy? So Stan said, and Stan, mind you, was very skeptical of anything paranormal, so he told this story somewhat in a befuddled way. He didn't know how to explain it. He said that Kenneth Anger walked behind this man who was sitting there at the kitchen table in the house. And as the guy was talking, Kenneth went and did some kind of mudra with his hand, and he lit the stove, and he was mouthing something, and next thing you know, the guy who was the stranger, not the stranger, but the friend who had come into the house, stopped in mid-sentence and fell asleep. And stayed that way till the end of the evening, at which point Kenneth went back to the stove, turned it off, and did some mudra, and the guy picked up his head and continued in mid-sentence. Okay? Very strange stuff. And I have other stories like that, But in fact, this is something that you see in, like in Star Wars, you may remember a scene, these are not the droids you're looking for, where the Alec Guinness, Obi-Wan Kenobi, says to the Star Troopers, these are not the droids you're looking for. He can control their mind. And Shelley used to talk about this to me, about the importance of being in control of your mind, lest other people control it for you. But it's not so much, I don't think the danger is so much magicians and all that. How many people are really going to run into that? I think there's a real problem there in terms of your mind being controlled by the world outside of you, in terms of, it could be TV, it could be advertisements, it could be, there was an interesting movie that came out years ago. Anybody here see the movie They Live by John Carpenter? It's a wonderful, lighthearted film, but it also deals, it's kind of a pre-Matrix notion of people controlled. They put on certain sunglasses and they see all these things around the city like you see in this picture here, consume, obey, and that we're being subtly manipulated in various ways. And Shelley said it's very important. If you want to become a mystic, it's very important to become aware of the ways in which you're manipulated by the world. Not just by people, but by the world and by your own thought patterns, by your own inner programs, by your own chakras. And to become more mindful, to become more aware of your own power, shall we say. And I'll relate one other story. I shouldn't relate this one, but I'm going to. Kriyananda told the story once about he learned through one means or another, he didn't say how, that someone was casting a curse on him. And so what he did, and this was, he realized, he gave the impression that he could sense this was serious business. And so what he did was he sat down and sent this person that was so seemingly cursing him, sent unselfish love towards that person. And he bombarded that person with unselfish love. For 3 days, he said, the better part of 3 days. I'm sure he got up to eat and things like that, but I'm sure that he meant it was 3 solid days of just love. And he said at the end of the 3 days, that person fell down the stairs and broke their neck. Okay, now, I mean, make of that what you will, but the point is it ricocheted. It ricocheted. And that I just came up for me recently online. Someone said, how do you protect yourself against negative thoughts? Because we're all connected, we're impacted by other people's thoughts, positive or negative. And the point of mysticism of yoga is to not be so easily influenced by other, be in control of your own thinking. And the simplest protection you can have is just sending out love, sending out kindness. Because you can't be affected by something if you're not relative to it. If you turn on a movie on TV and you're deeply disturbed by it, well, either turn it off or check to see why that bothers you so much and maybe work on that. Any questions about this very bizarre stuff I'm talking about here? The point of all this, in a word, is freedom. If there is any one idea that you find in the yogic tradition and the mystic tradition, it's becoming free. Becoming free from the world, becoming free from your own programs, your own inner stories, becoming free from the mental chatter, becoming free from your past, becoming free from the future. It doesn't mean a kind of a irresponsibility. That's not what I'm talking about, because there's still the kindness there's the compassion. But what I'm talking about is learning to be in control of yourself. That is the end goal of yoga, of I think all true mysticism. And Carl Jung had an interesting comment once, which was, free will is the ability to do gladly that which I must do. Let me say that again. Free will is the ability to do gladly that which I must do. There's no telling whether you really are as free as we would like, but you always have the choice of how you respond to what you're doing or what is happening. I hope that makes sense. Now what I want to do, because we need to wrap this up in a minute here, what I want to do is read this incredible, well, this is an interesting thing from The Matrix, where Morpheus is talking to Neo, what if I told you that you are a slave? That sounds pessimistic. It isn't. It's really, it's until you realize the degree to which you're enslaved by these programs, by the world, by the chakras, by your horoscope, if you're not aware of it, that is. To that degree, you are a slave in a sense, and mysticism is about becoming unenslaved, is that a word? Becoming free from that enslavement. What I want to do now is go to this extraordinary passage. One of the writers that Quest has published, and a dear friend of mine who I've known for several decades now, Normandy Ellis. She did an extraordinary book 20 years ago now called Awakening Osiris, which is her translations, very poetic translations of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, to use a phrase that not all Egyptologists like, but there's these texts that are quite profound but very mysterious if you don't understand them. And she took her own mystic poetic sensibility and translated them and came up with some truly remarkable passages. I consider it a truly great literature. And of all the writers I've dealt with, and I've dealt with hundreds of writers over the years, Normandy may be the most beautiful stylist I've come across, in this book in particular. But this is the passage in the book that I was most moved by. It's several pages. I want to read the whole thing. And I think you'll see the beauty of it. I don't have a scanner at home, so I had to put this under glass and photograph it so you can kind of see my reflection there a little bit in the glass. I wish I had a slightly better, there I am. I wish I had a slightly better copy of this, but I think you can read this. So let me go ahead and read through this. My mouth and hands were green, innocent seedlings, moments in time. Come, come, the beautiful one said. I grew in grace under the eyes of gods. I thought I was content, but the cat drank sweet milk and the ass bore the burden in the house of cross purposes. My joy was mindless, and I was afraid even of the shadows of passing clouds. I lived in the fear of loss. So, relinquishing comfort and ease, I journeyed. I have seen the broken down boughs of the fig tree overladen with fruit. I have seen death dance over desert sands, his bone-white head turned behind. I have offered up saffron and myrrh to goddesses. I know the bread and honey that old men like. I have walked 9 days in wonder down a long, dust-swept road just to say, you think you are awake, but you are asleep. When was the last day your heart slept and leapt and cried, I am alive in Egypt? I stand poised in the fragrance of purple amaranth. I am a flower that never dies. Lord of the winds, deliver me like a seed blown to fertile ground. What has become of the leopard's 3 spotted whelps who once played outside my door? Do their skins cover the hides of priests? Do their tails make fringe for the tax collector's wife's robe? Do the women and the priest cover their faces when they parade their souls in town? Let our lives and deaths be towards some purpose. I smell a change coming, a shape turning leaves in the wind. One night I went out under the cover of stars to the southern pool and bathed there among the lotus. My breast, my face, my buttocks, my feet I immersed in water and moonlight. I was silver, alive, no part of me untouched by beauty or dread. I rested. In the field of reeds that lay to the north, I heard grasshoppers chew the tender stalks, and 1,000 legs leapt into the silence as a snake slithered by, disturbing their feast. I saw, too, the luminous faces of the dead, sailors all, come quietly from the house of gods to bathe with mortals in the pool of lotus under a silver moon. We come night or day to this water of the spirit, they said. It is good to feel again the liquid pleasure of earth. It is good, I answered, and they were surprised, for as many as they are and as often as they come, few men of earth ever see them. They gave me their honeyed cake to eat, that I, like them, might pass through the villages invisible and touch with my feet the floor of the god's house in the sky. They gave me, too, a bitter cake, that when this night of spirits had long passed, I might eat again and remember. Who are you, brother? They asked. What is the secret name of your soul? From where do you get your power? I read the name etched on my heart. I am the sweet-smelling flowers of the olive tree, I said. Come, they said, and I took on the robe of night. We passed north of the towns through the rushes, and I saw through the windows of houses women bent in love above their husbands, old men staring into the dark, children dreaming of flying. What do you see? The sailors asked. I see flesh walking. I see souls Sheathed in paper, I see the spirits of 2 children hovering above a woman in love, waiting to jump into her belly and be born. I see comfort and sorrow, rejoicing and forgetting. I am staring into the heart of Egypt. Then the sailors reached into the air, shimmering around them, pulled down a stylus of fire and a tablet of crystal. Write it down, they said, and I wrote it down, and it seemed I was not so much recording what I had seen, but remembering what I already knew. Then they parted the bones of my chest with their hands and buried the tablet within my heart. As it touched me, crystal words sprang to my lips. A message coursed through my veins and etched itself in the lines of my palm. I became fertile ground in which the shining ones planted seed, into which I'd written my own destiny, taken on my own becoming that night, and that night began a new life. The stylus of fire extinguished itself, and its smoke curled through the air, a white ribbon weaving in and out of stars. We rose, following it like a flock of geese lifting easily off the surface of water, flying straight into heaven. Fly, they said, and we flew until we came to a great house in the sky made all of air. In it gods and goddesses were walking. They danced and sang, ate cakes, drank wine, and their laughter echoed through the night. And I knew I saw what, in the twinkling nights I had passed on earth, had seemed the quiet conversation of stars. I was amazed, struck dumb, and the sailors smiled. This is the party you've waited for. The ways have been arranged. Call it eternal life. Call it vibration. It lasts 1,000,000 years. Go in. The gods wait for you. I moved to enter, and the hand of a god touched me. This feast is for gods, he said. Are you a god? I turned in confusion. I am no god, I thought. I am only a man who has spent most of his days behind the ass of a donkey and plow. I am but a sack of bones covered with skin and often mud. I have no right to feast with gods. Hot tears of shame scoured my cheeks, and the shining ones laughed, slapping each other's backs. Have you forgotten so soon what you learned in the lotus pool? Try not thinking so much. Look at the words in your heart. I looked and saw, and facing the guardian said, I know you. I have seen you 1,000 times. You are the bolt of heaven, the truth, flickering light of the morning star. Who am I? Called another and another and another and another. Then I named them one by one. You are laughter asleep in 2 jugs of wine. You are the presence of gods on earth. And you, lady, are the white gazelle gracing earth, quick and beautiful. You are water bubbling out of the well. And you are the backbone of the sky. You are mother of birds, maker of nests, feeder of young, the soarer, the watcher. You are the blue eye of heaven, the gold knot of life. You are ether. You are the abyss, the mouth of the crocodile, the rose-colored mountain at dawn. You are the thoughts that gods see. You are the shadow, the shade of trees, the entrance of caves. You are wind, a lion walking in light. You are the arms of heaven. You are mistress of the house, a snake sleeping coiled in the water pot. You are mother and midwife and concubine. You are the sunfish darting between the reeds. You are the power of things alive, essence of flowers, of rams, of men. You are sorceress, mother of jackals, friend of sparrows, weeper of tears, singer of songs. You are my hands, my arms, my face, my feet. You are all parts of me. You live in my head and my heart and my belly. And I crossed the threshold of the great house. The gods embraced me with joy and weeping. It is good to have you here. No man comes home unless he knows in his soul who he is. You have lived too long away from us who are yourselves. The traveler Osiris, the sun, the god is home. Then I ate with them the bread of life and drank the wine of remembering. We danced and I was drunk with knowing and pleasure. I wore the white linen of a god. We danced until the walls of the great house burst into flame. The fire joined me to them, all to myself. I fell down and wept, and when at last I opened my eyes, I saw before me my own face reflected on the surface of a pool of water. I rose from my bath as the sun burst over the horizon. A new day had come. I had died in the night and been reborn. Then I dressed and walked the dusty path toward my house, thinking, my wife will be waking now. She will wonder where I have been. And I thought with pleasure of the amazement on her face when I would answer her, I was everywhere on heaven and earth with gods. Now that's a spectacular piece of writing. And if you remember the story that I told the first night of the old Coptic apocryphal story of the hymn, I forget the name of it. What is the name of that? The Hymn of the Pearl. This is akin to the Hymn of the Pearl. If you go back and read that side by side with that, you will really see an extraordinary similarity. But it deals with this idea of awakening to your own godlike nature, your own divinity. It's an ordinary person that's relating this story who joins the gods, and he realizes he's been a god all along. It's that spiritual individualism, you might say, if you want to read it that way. Anyway, that's all I wanted to cover here. Does anybody have any closing questions before we wrap up? I'll give you a minute or two here. Next week, I'll just say a couple of things while we're waiting, if anyone has anything. We are going to have the last class next week, where I wrap things up. I'm going to talk quite a bit about getting back, like I did in the first class, to the big picture. I'm going to talk quite a bit about that very mysterious poem that Shelley wrote as a Kabbalistic sort of document. Anything else? No? Okay, I'll see you next week. Namaste.